Good afternoon. Well, welcome to the Charleston Conference. Where do we go from here? And to the 2020 edition of The Innovators. My name is Darrell Gunter, and I will be your host today. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our esteemed panel of innovators. They will present in order of their introduction. First, we have from Brazil, Mr. Juan Castro and Dr. Hilde van Zeeland of Writefull, Mr. Stephen Howe, the Senior Product Manager of CCC. From Index Data, we have Mr. Sebastian Hammer, the President, Ms. Jill Morris, and Ms. Christina Rose. Last but not least, my good friend, Mr. Jamie Hutchins. He's the Director of Open Access Innovation at ProQuest. Our panel will conduct their presentations, and afterwards we will engage in a live Q&A. Please be sure to utilize the Q&A and chat feature. Note that if we're not able to address your questions directly, those questions will be answered by the panelists after the conference. And we'll be sure to follow up with you. Now, without further delay, I am pleased to present the 2020 edition of The Innovators.
Hi everybody, my name is Hilde van Zeeland and I'm an applied linguist at Writefull. In this talk, I'd like to introduce you to Writefull, explain how it works, and show you how it's used to speed up academic publishing. This is us. With me today is Juan Castro, co-founder and CEO at Writefull. Juan is the brain behind the AI technology that we use, which you'll hear more about on the next slides. So what is Writefull? Writefull is a service offering automated proofreading for science. We started Writefull several years ago to help researchers with their academic writing. And this was at a time when we ourselves were doing our PhDs and we had to write a lot. And we sometimes struggled, like most researchers. It can be tricky, academic writing, especially for those who don't speak English as their first language. And this struggle can slow down not only the writing process for the researcher, but also the publishing process for the publisher. Because poorly written articles simply need more copy editing attention, and they can clog the publishing pipeline. So what Writefull does is correct mistakes in scientific texts. And to do this, it uses deep learning language models. And deep learning is a strand of artificial intelligence. We developed our own language models, and we trained these on millions of journal articles. And from these articles, Writefull's models learned the patterns of academic English. So its grammar, its vocabulary, punctuation, its style, etc. And they can now correct sentences that don't follow these patterns. And often this is due to language errors. So on this slide, you see some examples of the feedback that these models give. In the first example, you see the author wrote material and methods. This is a section heading of a paper. And because Writefull has seen this heading very often in the papers it has processed, it corrects this into materials, plural, and methods. And this is where you see the power of the models, because there's no real sentence here, there's no syntax, and still the model manages to correct it. The second is an example of Writefull changing the preposition from on to in, because it's the role of something in something and not on something. The third is an example of spelling being corrected. And here you again see it's not a simple spell check, but it's really a model at work. It corrects the typo from explode to explore, and both are spelled fine, but in this sentence only the second really works. And the last example, we see the verb form being fixed. And this is again quite impressive, looking at the fact that the subject is all the way at the beginning of the sentence. And it's a very long and complex sentence with a lot of nouns in between the subject and the verb. And again, only a very well-trained language model can really fix an error like this. And this is what Writefull looks like. So the user can upload a text. So this is usually a manuscript. And then gets to see a report with the language errors fixed in green. And at the top, an overview of the language suggestions given across 5 categories. And this report is interactive, so you can click these green corrections to accept them and then continue to download the revised document. As you can imagine, this advanced language check can be used for different purposes in scholarly communication. Publishers use it. In most cases, they offer Writefull to their authors pre-submission. So before submitting their manuscript, the author is invited to use Writefull to improve the language of the paper. And this gives the publisher better written papers, speeding up their publishing cycle. And post-submission, publishers use Writefull to quickly evaluate the language quality of their papers for triaging purposes. And some also use Writefull to assess the work of their copy editors. Students and researchers, they use Writefull to write and to check their texts. Besides the language report I just showed you, we offer several products for them, like a Microsoft Word add-in. Institutions use it in the form of a license for their students and staff. And finally, copy editors and typesetters, they use Writefull to speed up their editing. So going back to the publishers, as I said, they can use Writefull before or after submission. Examples of two publishers that we're currently working with are Hilde and Cambridge University Press, and they both use Writefull pre-submission. So here on the slide, you see the process that authors go through. So first, on the journal submission page, they're invited to use Writefull before submitting their paper, and they then continue to upload their manuscript. They fix the errors, and then they return to the journal page to submit their revised manuscript. Hilde shared with us how the use of Writefull affected their pipeline, which you see here. And the average time it took to accept papers decreased by 20 days. Manuscript processed by Writefull also needed fewer rounds of review and raised fewer language issues. And finally, Hilde saw an increase of first-time acceptances. So these are very positive results for both the publisher and the author. In addition to the language check, we also offer a solution that lets authors or publishers check if a text is complete in terms of citations. And citing is, of course, a tricky thing for researchers. And then I'm not referring to how to cite, but when to cite. It's easy for authors to skip adding citations because they think that what they're reporting is general knowledge, while often it's not, or because they simply forget to. So what Cite does is use, again, a deep learning model to analyze each sentence in the text and to suggest where citations may be missing. And again, this can be used by the student or the researcher to check their text, or it can also be used by the publisher. So this is what Cite looks like. Here you see a text that has been uploaded. Writefull says it has 6 sentences that are missing citations, which you see here at the top. And those sentences are highlighted in the text. And right behind them, the confidence level of Writefull's model is shown. And the closer to 1, the more confident Writefull is. So the first sentence highlighted, for example, reads, "The concept of problem gambling, etc., has been estimated to have prevalence between, etc." So here Writefull shows with a confidence level of 0.98, which is very confident, that the author should add a citation. So this is how Writefull Cite helps to check for referencing completeness of a text which can, just like the language revision, be used on the researcher or the publisher side, as I said before. So this was it. So the previous slide gave you hopefully an idea of what Writefull is and how it uses text data as well as the latest AI techniques to help researchers and publishers. The first with writing and with citing, helping them to get published, and the second with triaging and editing manuscripts and thereby speeding up the overall publishing process. So thanks for listening. Should you have any questions, feel free to ask now or contact us later. Thank you very much.
Hello and welcome. My name is Stephen Howe, and I'm a Senior Product Manager with Copyright Clearance Center. I'm happy to be presenting at the 2020 Charleston Conference and am pleased to be part of this innovation panel. Today, I will be talking about leveraging data analytics in publishing to find information and to discover new insights. Specifically, I'm going to be talking about how we can use analytical tools such as a knowledge graph to help publishers wade through the deluge of newly published research on COVID-19. The world has been and continues to be impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The global research community has gone into high gear to study this disease and to share their research in hopes of finding a solution. This increase in research output has impacted CCC's customers, the scientific publishers, as they struggle to find enough quality peer reviewers to keep up with the influx of manuscript submissions. I don't need to speak about these numbers in the abstract. I am sharing on my screen a graph produced by the National Library of Medicine showing the weekly count of new COVID publications. Since early 2020, the National Library of Medicine has produced LitCovid, a curated list of publications about the 2019 novel coronavirus. And you can see from the graph, since the beginning of May, there have been an average of 2,000 new publications a week. From the perspective of a publisher overseeing peer-reviewed journals, that is a tremendous amount of new manuscripts to vet, edit, and publish. As publishers continue to do good work and to get quality scientific research out on COVID, CCC has sought to contribute in our own way. Leveraging some internally built tools, we developed a knowledge graph. We call it the COVID author graph to help publishers identify potential peer reviewers in the COVID space. Before I speak more about CCC's author graph, it will be worthwhile to talk about knowledge graphs in general. Graphs, or a graph database, describe a particular approach for storing data that emphasizes entities and their relationships. Generally speaking, graphs are created by processing large volumes of data from disparate data sources in order to identify, extract, and disambiguate entities and their properties through statistical inference. Creating graph data is a very powerful way to explore connections between different kinds of things and to be able to query the relationships between those things explicitly. When thinking about a graph, it is important to think about three key areas. First, your data sources. Your data sources provide the foundational information that will become part of your graph. Second, how the data is processed. Your graph pipeline is what processes your data and, through inference and modeling, identifies the entities and the relationships that make up your graph data. And third, how will you interact with and visualize the data? Your user interface or application is what facilitates exploration and querying of your graph data. In response to the problem faced by publishers on how to manage the swelling number of COVID-related publications and their need to identify peer reviewers, CCC has created a knowledge graph of authors for COVID publications. Our COVID author graph uses a dataset consisting of published authors in virology, with special attention to coronaviruses, including SARS, MERS, SARS-CoV-2, and COVID-19. When I say that we have created a knowledge graph of authors, I want to be clear that we addressed the three key areas I described earlier. We used bibliographic citation metadata for articles listed by LitCovid, Cord19, and other sources. We processed this data through our own pipeline in order to produce graph data describing authors and their publishing relationships to other authors. The end result is a data set of over 100,000 articles and over 400,000 unique authors. And finally, we build an interactive visualization tool through which one can explore the data. And just what type of insights can a knowledge graph help you discover? Let us find out. Let me offer 3 examples of how knowledge graphs can help you discover new insights from your data. First, knowledge graphs let you filter large amounts of data to just the data that is pertinent to you right now. For example, in this view of our COVID dataset, each author is represented by a blue circle, and each line connecting 2 circles indicates that these 2 authors have co-authored a paper together. I mentioned earlier that we have over 400,000 authors in our dataset. If we were to display all 400,000 authors at the same time, it would be unreadable and nonsensical. So instead, I have chosen to display the most prolific authors, those who have published at least 30 articles in our dataset and who have co-authored papers with at least 3 different people. Filtering large amounts of data based on specific criteria about the relationships described in that data is just one way knowledge graphs can reveal new insights. Second, knowledge graphs let you find new relationships that may not be obvious when looking at or searching non-graph data. When exploring graph data, relationships become quite obvious when plotted visually. Here, for example, we can see clear and distinct groups of authors who have published together. What is just as obvious are those groups of authors who have not published together. This could be a very useful observation in the peer reviewer context. Depending on my editorial perspective, I can use these visual groupings to identify people who are familiar with another author's work. Or, conversely, I can use these visual groupings to identify people who have worked independently from another author's work. Third, knowledge graphs let you focus your data by querying for an intersection or union of key properties of an entity or relationship. In our author graph, we facilitate this kind of focus by allowing the users to visually annotate the graph with different highlights based on the MESH, the medical subject headings, ontology. This allows the user to quickly identify authors who sit at the intersection of different applied criteria. For example, by highlighting authors who have published articles aligned to specific MESH terms, I can quickly find an author who has published in 3 different topic areas. For example, lung diseases, respiratory tract infections, and pharmacologic actions. Such an author is indicated here with the orange arrow. I hope this presentation has helped you to better understand how analytics, and specifically knowledge graphs, can help you discover new insights in your data, and how CCC used COVID publication metadata to better understand the researcher and author landscape for this particular field of study. The COVID author graph, and even publishing data in general, are but examples of the types of entities and relationships that you can explore with knowledge graphs. Knowledge graphs and the exploration of entities and the relationships for useful insights is appropriate to any domain, and ultimately, knowledge graphs will be specific to your underlying data. Thank you for listening.
Hi, everybody. I'm Christina Rose. I'm the Associate Dean for Collections and Content Strategy at New York University. I'm joined today by Sebastian Hammer, President of Index Data, and Jill Morris on Twitter, Director of PALSI. We're honored to be here today to talk about reshare and opportunities for controlled digital lending. I wanted to start by setting the context for reshare and CDL. Project Reshare was formed in 2018 with the original goal to develop an open source, community-owned and managed tool for consortial resource sharing. In August of 2020, Reshare released Reshare 1.0, its first minimally viable product, software release, which supports consortial borrowing of books, or in ILL terms, returnables. The first release includes an out-of-the-box discover layer and a shared index. Future releases will include support for shared print, collections analysis, and the topic of today, digital lending. I wanted to say Reshare is so much more than a software. It is a community of consortia, libraries, and commercial partners working together to enable the sharing of collective collections in all formats and empowering library-driven, user-centered workflows. This community has responded to the urgent need for libraries to provide digital alternatives to print collections and retool print operations to support dispersed students and faculty. The ability to share digital files securely was on our roadmap long before COVID-19, but the mass library closures, including the closures at many of the libraries beta testing Reshare 1.0, prompted Reshare to shift its priorities towards tools to support digital ILL and control digital lending. Last spring, a group within Reshare collaborated to build use cases for digital lending. We explored the white paper on controlled digital lending, which outlines the model for CDL. The CDL model applies print-like circulation practices to digital objects, enabling libraries to loan a digital copy of print material, but in a controlled way, which protects the rights of authors and publishers. We also looked at CDL in practice with models such as the Internet Archive's Open Library and the, at that time, emerging HathiTrust temporary access services. Both of these services provided critical access to content in libraries from the earliest days of the pandemic. Our group also explored our own library stories and struggles to provide robust and accessible services to distant students and faculty. We found that CDL provided libraries a useful model, but most libraries needed tools to safely and flexibly implement CDL and to integrate it within the context of other digital lending services, such as resource sharing. Sebastian's going to talk a lot more specifically about these tools, but I first wanted to share a photo which illustrates the need for rethinking some of the way we share print collections. This is a picture of my interlibrary loan department taken in mid-August. We had hundreds and hundreds of boxes waiting for us when we returned from our lockdown. Many of these boxes contained undelivered books sent from other libraries. ILL departments in libraries spend an inordinate amount of energy and money shipping print books around the globe. There are so many libraries experimenting with using CDL to meet their own student and faculty's needs for print resources right now. It's a very exciting moment. But I think the case for CDL extends far beyond meeting the challenges of this moment and rethinking how we can use our existing communities to share resources more sustainably in the future.
Hi, everybody. I'm Sebastian from Index Data. Really happy to be here with all of you. I'm going to talk about what we've done in the project so far and what our direction is. As Christina mentioned, we formed a working group as soon as we kind of decided in the project that we needed to focus on CDL as a strategic purpose within the project. We set up a working group to better understand what impact we could have on CDL and what the unmet needs were in the community so far. As Christina mentioned, there are libraries that are already engaging in CDL on an ad hoc basis, and to meet the challenges of COVID, there are also emergent large-scale services like HATI and Internet Archive. We came at CDL from a slightly different perspective, really wanting to explore what it would look like to integrate CDL more deeply into everyday library activities and processes, specifically thinking about how CDL would affect library workflows, how it might intersect existing processes for digitizing chapters and journal articles and so on, and how it would interface and engage with the library system locally to manage access to resources, to manage the intersection with the library's inventory in the ILS and so on. From that initial analysis, we built kind of a model, an interpretation, if you will, of the abstraction of CDL into more concrete processes. And this diagram captures that at a high level. The process really starts with a user placing a request from a discovery layer, pushing that into a system using OpenURL as a general purpose mechanism. This area have focused on the idea of having automated and manual processes for determining whether a given request is a suitable candidate for CDL, depending on the risk profile of the university, but depending on the current situation regarding access to the physical collection and so on. From there on, if a material or request is approved for CDL, we would be able to determine whether the material has already been scanned. If not, we could print pick lists to retrieve the material from the shelf and queue up a scanning operation, and finally push it through a DRM, a digital rights management process, to actually deliver the material to the patron in a secure way. And all of this would be done including interactions with the ILS, both to validate the patron and his access to the material, and to ensure that we're not lending more digital copies of the material than the library has ownership of physical copies. We then took this kind of model of CDL that we developed and turned it into a set of requirements for a piece of software that might help a library support this approach to CDL. And the main components that you see here in the middle are, again, functions for automated and manual approval, the application of policies that you could potentially modify through a semester as situations change and evolve, the ability to print things like pick slips, supporting scanning workflows, sending emails to patrons, and again, integration with the ILS to authenticate patrons or identify them, to ensure that we are basing a lend on the real availability of materials, supporting check-ins and check-outs and so on, as well as integration with scanning processes that might be different in different libraries, as well as the whatever DIM tools that the library would choose to use. And finally, we have a real vision for bringing in interoperability and consortial collaboration into the mix. We share, as a system, is heavily based on a standard called ISO 18626, which supports and expresses the requests and responses that go back and forth between libraries that engage in resource sharing. And we're already working with the standards community to extend that standard to embrace and include CDL as well. The last thing I want to do is encourage you to visit our website, our project website, to learn more, to reach out to us by email. We also have a demo of the current version of Reshare here, and just come join in, help us make this happen. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Hutchins. I'm the Director of Open Access Innovation at ProQuest. Thank you for the invitation to present today at the Innovation Lightning Round Charleston Library Conference. As I look outside my window today with more than 3 inches of snow on the ground in October in Boston, it's never been truer to say that I truly wish I was at Charleston today. To give you some background and insight into ProQuest and the scale at which we work, we serve over 26,000 libraries globally and have penetration of over 98% of the world's top research institutions. Across our various holdings and services, we support more than 3.2 billion searches per year. So any innovation or platform changes that we make has to happen on a scale which requires intricate understanding of our users and careful planning. The innovation or the initiative I want to talk about is meeting users where they are. This is about streamlining content discoverability and user access to the content that libraries purchase from us, but also acknowledging that the way people interact with the internet and where they find content is changing. One of the biggest changes, obviously, this year that none of us anticipated was COVID-19 and mass shutdowns across the globe. So supporting distance learning, teaching and research has never been more important than it is this year. Enhancing library current and future investments is absolutely core to how we operate as a company. So anything that we do needs to drive value for our customers. And the scholarly publishers that we work with, among many other publishers of different content types, increasingly have open access content. And our belief is that this requires broader visibility and discovery and to be on a level playing field with any other content type. Innovation for us starts with our users. And some of the tools that we use that are available to us would include interviews. So the selection that I have here are young researchers who are at grad school and actually represent different subject interests and different stages in their research focus. Some results are unsurprising. They all tell us that Google is their first stop, and we knew this from data logs already. What we weren't expecting to hear from them was that when they search for ProQuest, they expect to actually be able to search for content. And interestingly, search.proquest.com wasn't seen by them as a place they were inclined to select. Rather, that what they expected was proquest.com to be the place to search for content. This gave us some insights we hadn't had before. We looked at our search logs and we found actually a considerable traffic of people trying to find content on our corporate sites. The other thing we learned was that the user logins, which would have taken them to the content that their libraries had already purchased on their behalf, were either hidden or they just didn't notice. And that meant we had to address that. What they also told us was they wanted more information about what they were searching, and they wanted to understand what they might be able to find once they had gone to the effort of logging in. Among the interviews that we created, the workshops, dozens and dozens of other kinds of interventions where we found out about our users in more detail, we created very detailed story maps. And what this gave us was the ability to look at the user journey and to understand the differences in user journeys as well for people coming into the sites from different locations. As we moved across the user journey, we're able to add more detail and more stories around the kind of expectations that our users have. And this allows us to coordinate the developments into logical patterns and releases, allowing us to meet the needs of our users, but also to coordinate and align the developers that we have working on multiple parts of our platforms. From concept to launch in less than a year, in June this year, we went from a very dark grey entry point requiring somebody to log into their library, before they saw any content, to a very interactive and very open platform with nearly 700 million records currently available to users. Many of those documents weren't indexed by any major indexing service previously. We also changed the locus of our corporate site and moved that to about ProQuest.com. So all the information for our customers is still available. But the user expectations that we have are you go to ProQuest to search for content. And that's the primary use case we wanted to address. The way that we now present ourselves on Google has changed. ProQuest.com is our search engine location, and about ProQuest.com is where you go for corporate information and for information about our products. In August this year, we also introduced a changed search experience that was configurable by our customers for their patrons. And this allows them to either continue to restrict their searches within ProQuest to that they subscribe to, or to configure it so that they could actually search outside of their library subscription and see a greater breadth of content that would be available. One of the most interesting parts of this being open access content. So having created an open web interface where users can see full text open access, we wanted to make sure there was consistency for those people starting from an authenticated view. So we made our publicly available content database available to all of our customers. And again, it's configurable on their end. But what this allows is that their users have access to all open access content on our systems. Later in November, we will also introduce the Lti Integration, and this will allow administrators to connect ProQuest platform to learning management systems, and for their faculty to then seamlessly connect their students to resources within ProQuest and to assign activities within the LMS. What we know is that this will make it much more likely that students will use the resource, and this will drive usage and increase the return on investment for our library customers. At this point, we're still engaged with the process of re-indexing 700 million documents and essentially re-engineering each of our document views to make them indexable. We expect this to continue through the course of this year and significantly into next year. Overall, this initiative to meet users where they are, we went from concept to launch in less than a year. Along the path, what we found out was that we needed to change the way that we as a company presented ourselves on search engines. We have a considerable amount of content which we have to formulate in correct patterns so that it optimizes the search engines in terms of indexing. And over the course of next year, we already have plans to add significant new content sets to this open platform. In short, what we've created is a platform for what we believe to be the future of innovation with ProQuest, and one that will serve our users and our customers better in future. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Bravo, bravo, bravo. That was magnificent. Wow, 4 great presentations. Now, without further delay, let's jump into some questions. I'm gonna kick it off because I have a question for each of our panelists, and we're gonna start off in the order that they presented. The conference theme is, where do we go from here? What advice would you provide to a potential customer about getting started with a product, your product or service that is very innovative? And so if Juan Castro and Hilde, you want to take that question first? And unmute yourself, please. You have to unmute yourself.
That's important.
There you go.
Thanks, Gunter. I think for us, what is important right now is to get more publishers interested in our offering and start trialing this with authors and getting more feedback as we are improving the product as we are going.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. Hilde, anything that you would like to add into?
No, not really. I think Juan summarized it very well. I think the publishers, they really see on a day-to-day basis what authors struggle with, and also what really affects their pipeline negatively or positively. So I think that we're really using that to improve the product from here.
Okay, excellent. Stephen, from your perspective of what you're doing at CCC, that was very intricate. Thank you for that great presentation.
Thank you.
What recommendations would you give to our fellow library community about getting started with a very innovative product?
Certainly. I'm a product manager, so I'm going to give you a very product manager answer of like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? And so if I bring that to the knowledge graphs and really any analytics product, it's really driven by what's the question you're trying to answer. And that will really shape where you need to go. A knowledge graph and what I described, is a very powerful tool, but it's not necessarily, useful for everything. So I think focusing on what problem you have to solve, what questions you're trying to answer, and then for CCC, we're very willing to listen and help you through that process.
Excellent, excellent. Now, from our index data colleagues, Sebastian, Jill, and Kristen, jump in.
I can take a shot. I would, speaking from a project reshare perspective and from an index data perspective, I would say that the most central aspect of reshare as far as engagement with the community is the notion that the product is fundamentally owned by the community in this model. We as a service provider came into reshare because we believe that there was a need to really rewrite the rules of engagement between vendors and service providers on one side and consumers of the software and services. So the whole notion of reshare is that we as a community own the intellectual property that we create together, and the product management structure all the way from strategy over product prioritizations to functional definitions and development are carried out by us together in kind of a joint governance model. And I have found it to be an extremely powerful model, and I would encourage libraries and consortia and other vendors to engage in similar kinds of conversations with their peers and their community, whatever it is that they are seeking to develop, of whatever new kind of functionality or product that they find that they need.
Right. Christina, your perspective?
So I'm working in a library now. So in terms of just Project Reshare, what we're doing right now is we're involved in the implementers group. We are thinking about our policies and how and use cases for how when we get when the MVP for this comes out, how are we going to use it? And so what we're focused on a lot is we have global campuses, and we're focused on how do we really serve those distant students, especially in this time where we don't have so much access to print. So that's there's a lot of groundwork to be laid, and I look Project Reshare has a lot of flexibility in what you can do. So that I think I'm thinking about what's the best first use case for this.
Right. And Jill, from the PALCI perspective, I know you're in the background, but I'm curious to get your perspective because PALCI is there to help support libraries to provide better services.
Yeah, and I think from a consortium perspective, the thing we're looking to do is connect the shared needs across many different institutions, a diversity of institutions. And I guess one thing I think about a lot with open source community owned projects is that it's very easy to sit back and say, I'm going to wait for somebody else to do it. But there's so much opportunity here to come together around those shared needs and to create community owned solutions. And so my, piece here, I guess, would be just to say, don't wait. There's so much opportunity for groups to come together and work on something that we can then own, co-own, and really continue to innovate on, which has been the struggle over time, is that we struggle to innovate on the systems that we're dependent on. So this is a really great opportunity to change that paradigm and to create those connections. And my role within the consortium is just to harness the energy that's already there and to bring it to projects like this. And that's been a really exciting place to be. So definitely working through consortia collaborating across consortial boundaries has been very exciting here. And then that collaboration with commercial developers and having people who are interested in that shared vision is really exciting.
Excellent, excellent. And Jamie, you gave us a very detailed presentation about what's going on over there at ProQuest, and it seems like ProQuest is constantly innovating. How do you work within the library community with the situation with the budgeting and getting them to try these new services?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we occupy a sort of fairly interesting position in the ecosystem. We work between publishers and librarians. We have advisory boards on almost all of our products as well, directly with the librarians. But I think the really interesting and sort of unique thing is trying to work with libraries as a customer, but also to reflect upon the needs of their users and their patrons. And increasingly what we're trying to work out is how we get those sort of groups to talk to each other more, how we feed back to our library customers from the kind of unique insights that we can gather as well. And I think Stephen talked about it a little bit in terms of product perspective, is getting focused on like real use cases and not the ones that really make a difference, trying to really understand what people are trying to achieve. I think that's a key thing that we're looking to develop in the future. Right, exactly.
And so when Juan, if we think about what is the compelling feature, I mean, Writefull, it makes so much sense. And you talked about, getting more involved, getting more publishers involved. But what about from the academic point of view of trying to build these new scientific minds in the undergraduate level, if you will, to use Writefull? What are your thoughts there as getting them to realize that this very innovative product of Writefull can really help them and their university to produce better papers?
That's a good question. Thanks, Darrell. I think, well, we are currently already running pilots with some universities. And the thing with Writefull is that Writefull is not just to correct the language of your manuscript or essay, but is more broad. So Writefull also helps you in the composition of your sentences. So you can say whether you're writing a different section of a manuscript, like an introduction, and you can get example sentences you could use to get started. You can also, we have something called language search that you can also use to search for phrases and see how other authors have used those phrases in different contexts. So I think Writefull is just not for checking the language quality of a already written manuscript, but also help you in the crafting of it. So that is, I think, one strong point for institutions to try it at least.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And did Hilde want to chime in at all?
Yeah, I think maybe what also appeals to students is that it's a very new approach to giving and getting feedback, because it uses AI, right? So a lot of the feedback also shows the confidence levels of the language models. So you can really see, all right, the tool is this confidence, this should be this, or that confidence, that it should be that. And I think that's a very new approach. So it's not just right or wrong, it's not black or white, but you can really play with the models. And I think that also appeals to especially younger users.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. And so, Stephen, as you know, there are many search engines out there, right? There's a garden variety.
Yeah.
What have you seen thus far that is setting CCC apart with what you're doing with this COVID literature that maybe is giving researchers the edge up in finding that needle in the haystack?
Yeah, and that's a great perspective, because if we go back to what I was saying earlier, what's the question you're trying to solve? And they may all sound the same, right? So if we take a corpus of literature, in our case, COVID, there's many reasons you might be searching for it. CCC's traditional model, we call it known item search. I have something, I want to get a license for it. It's a very, you probably drop in a DOI, done. There's broader search. Jamie can talk a lot about this in terms of ProQuest, is like, I need to discover, search in the sense of discovery. I have 700 million artifacts here. How do I find the one that's relevant to the criteria I set? I think knowledge graphs give another dimension to search, and these are really complementary. So that's part of why I say you need to know why you're entering this. And so knowledge graphs are really good at exposing relationships and connections between things. It's a bit of an overused phrase, but when Google in 2012 kind of popularized the term knowledge graph, they had this phrase, things, not strings, meaning we're moving search from keywords to now I'm actually looking at entities. And so I think that's, if it's appropriate to your problem space, knowledge graphs really allows you to play with relationships and understand relationships.
Excellent, excellent.
Yep.
And Sebastian and Jill and Christina, I'm curious as to if you have conducted studies in regards to how your system will improve productivity and save time. What are your thoughts there about that?
Maybe Christina can speak to some of this a little better than I can, but at least in terms of the consortium perspective, one of the things we really look forward to with a system like Reshare is sort of the unmediated aspects of the system, which really save on staff time and processing, connects disparate ILS systems across many different libraries. And collectively, when you take all of that together, saves just a ton of staff time and energy in getting the items that the consortium has in the hands of the user that actually needs it. And so oftentimes what we'll do is we'll say, we're saving at least 15 to 20 minutes per transaction. You start to add that up in terms of staff time, and it's significant when you look at the scale of borrowing that's happening inside of a consortium. And then you start to think about controlled digital lending and all of the time that you might save on physically shipping an item and the money spent on physically getting an item from one location to the next. So we don't have the data on that front yet, but that's where we're starting from, is just, we spend thousands and thousands of dollars shipping items to our users when we could be delivering them digitally. And I think that's where we're looking forward to seeing the impact there. But Christina or Sebastian, you might have other thoughts.
I might also just speak about the experience of working with index data when they came to NYU and watched what our student workers were doing, and tested out a wireframe, a prototype on our student workers. And we found out all sorts of interesting things about the pick slips. I mean, these are small things, but they make a big difference when you're trying to match a book with an item, things like that. I know that our head of access services right now is on the implementers group, and she says, we've spent the whole meeting talking about what should be on that pick slip. I'm like, that's exactly right, because if you get that part right, then your students aren't stumbling over it. You're not training people to do stuff that's totally needless. So, and then the other time saver here, and it's, if we think about CDL at a consortial level, it means that at NYU, I might be contributing a scan. And if you own a print copy of that, you might be able to use my scan. I mean, this is very early days for this, and that's not where NYU is going to start immediately with CDL, but I think that Reshare builds the potential to do something like that. And that's when you think about shared labor, that's huge, because scanning an entire book is not trivial.
Right.
And we're all losing our student budgets now. I mean, that's another thing. You hear in this whole conference about budgets, and you think about it's budgets for collections, but it's also budgets for labor. And so how are we going to start sharing that? And how can publishers work with us on that too? Yes.
Christina, I was thinking also before the sessions that we had at NYU and at other libraries in the project, a big part of the conversation within the project was how can a group of libraries working together in a consortium replicate some of the experience that people have become used to from services like Amazon, where you have a very tightly integrated model of logistics and service delivery, discoverability, and transparency for the end user. So putting the patron experience in the center was really central to the project, and just looking at breaking down all the barriers to having a really smooth patron experience, all the way from looking at what staff workflows go on, what are the things that might slow the process down, to looking at deeper integration with shipping systems. How can we get the tracking numbers right into the system so that when the patron asks when he can expect to see his thing, we can actually give sort of an Amazon-esque kind of answer to him, rather than just, well, you'll get it when you get it.
Right.
So that's been a big part of it.
You know, because when I saw that picture that Christina showed of the stack, well, not stack, I mean, it was like a mountain of stuff that was waiting there. And I guess the poor readers are just waiting to get this information to facilitate their research. So absolutely, absolutely.
Exactly right. And some of them didn't get it, right? We just had to ship it right back to the borrowing library. So.
Wow. So Jamie, I'm curious. Early days of the big announcement that ProQuest had, are you finding that the community is loving the new ProQuest search?
I think we're still in the days where they're finding the ProQuest new search, to be honest with you. As I mentioned, there's sort of so many documents that we're starting to re-index. We'll start to see, I think, a big change as we shift into that process, and especially when we engage more with the big search engines, Google, Bing, and Yahoo especially. But we had over 1 million retrievals, I think, in the first month. So that's just sort of organic search that's happening there. As we moved away from search being on its own sort of URL and moved towards ProQuest.com, we also saw another spike coming up there as well. And I think later this month, what we're really interested in is the effect that the Lti integration will have. So actually making content available within a learning management system in our current climates as well, with people engaging in remote learning. I think we'll start to see different usage patterns there. And so we're starting to see different activity levels happening in different spaces, and trying to understand the data that we're getting as well.
You know, our panel is winding down. This has been an excellent panel, but we have a few minutes left. But I don't see any questions from the community, but I do want to ask this question about artificial intelligence and the concern that some people have that AI is going to take away people's jobs. So I would love to hear the panel's thoughts about why AI is going to be beneficial and not detrimental to the academe university. So Hilde and Juan, let's start off with you. What are your thoughts? I mean, you're building, you're using AI for Writefull, so I'm sure you're a pro, but I'm just curious to see if you feel that it's going to replace anyone's position.
I don't want to think that it's going to be replacing positions. I think some of the jobs might shift because the use of AI will help streamlining some of the processes that are very repetitive, like what the same of the, when we created, right, we were copying books by hand, and then we created machines to copy books for us. It's just really streamlining, so our time can be used in different ways. That's the way I like to see it. Okay.
All right. Hilde, any perspective from your point of view?
No, not really. No.
All right. Good. Stephen, what are your thoughts there, Stephen?
Oh, I definitely think that AI is an enabler, especially in this space. If we go back to your previous question and kind of talking about the different flavors of search, search because you know exactly what you're looking for, search in terms of discovery, and then search in terms of knowledge graphs discovery. AI, so part of a knowledge graph, part of the process of creating that data is taking a body of information, a knowledge base, and using machine learning or other AI processes to infer those entities.
Yes.
And it's something like even like the data set we used for our COVID author graph is pretty small in the large scheme of things. But if you had to go through all 100,000 articles and manually identify who authored which one, and are they the same author as this other, is the Stephen Howe on this paper the same as S. Howe on this paper, and do all that, you wouldn't, right? And that's just one small data set. So I really see, Juan used this word, it really is an efficiency. It opens up all these new areas of information that we wouldn't be able to do without the support of these inferential and modeling approaches.
All right. Sebastian and Jill and Christina, what are your thoughts about AI?
I'll kick mine in real quick. I think, first of all, I think that there are there are certainly opportunities for AI to assist libraries in lots of ways, not to take positions away from librarians, but to deliver better services or to enable libraries to work more efficiently in anything from acquisition and the choice of new materials to add to your collection to how services that are delivered to the patron. But most of all, the thing that has struck me over and over again as AI has been discussed in our community has been, I want to see libraries and librarians engaging in artificial intelligence and those kinds of technologies, because I think we need libraries to be knowledgeable, to be able to take part in the conversation about when and how these technologies should be applied. I see them misapplied in lots of situations where they cause harm or inefficiency by creating false assurances, or by violating people's privacy, or in other sorts of ways. And I feel like libraries and the position that they hold in society makes them really good arbiters and just a counterweight to a purely commercial view on how AI should be applied. So I just love to see many more libraries and librarians having AI literacy and pursuing projects and gaining an understanding of these technologies.
Yes, yes, yes. Yes. Christina or Jill?
I think Sebastian pretty much said it. So I'm one of those librarians that probably needs to know more about AI. I do hope it ends up with more interesting jobs for staff that work in libraries, because we have a lot of very labor-intensive jobs that are bad for people's bodies. And I'd like to see it be used for positive things.
And I think there's so many opportunities for collective collections, especially with AI and being able to predict. I think about reshare and all of the opportunities that could be there once we know more about what we're collectively doing, gathering that data together and applying it in a way that doesn't acquire such a manual workflow that we have right now. We have very limited data about what we're doing, or it's very onerous to go through the process of applying it. And so I look forward to those types of applications, because we don't have the budgets to do things the way we always did them, and nor should we. The technology is there. So there's lots of opportunity, I think, to start to actually apply some of the ideals of collective collections that many consortia and libraries have been talking about for ages to this space. And I think reshare actually has a lot of opportunities here that we haven't yet even really scratched the surface on.
Excellent, excellent. Jamie.
Yeah, I think it's the potential of AI that really intrigues us, and certainly in this space. Reflecting some of the comments that have already been made there, we have a lot of human knowledge that's being applied in different ways, but done at a smaller scale at the moment, which I think we can really enhance how the content sets that we have can be used and how they can be then used in new applications. Some of the things that I've learned just coming to ProQuest in the last year, the differences between how people use information in, say, business studies as opposed to the sciences where I worked, where my colleagues who work with music, how they actually interact with their users there, and how do you search musical scores when you look at something like that. And then just the differences between, say, an undergraduate who is doing research for an assignment as opposed to a researcher or a faculty member. And I think artificial intelligence can be used in a number of ways to link information in a way that we can't currently do if we're using humans to do that kind of indexing.
Well, as always, I always like to give my guests the last word or comment. And so I like to go down through our fellow presenters here today to take 15, 20 seconds to give the last word or comment about your respective service. Juan Castro.
Yeah, well, I would just like any librarian or publisher just to go to our website and take a look and give us any feedback that they might have. I think that would be great. It doesn't matter the size of the publishers or library. Just some feedback for us would be great.
Excellent, excellent. Mr. Howe, sir.
Certainly. And I think my parting message is I gave an example of one knowledge graph, a COVID author graph, but really there are many knowledge graphs, and it's that combination of what data are you starting with. That's also something we didn't talk about with AI. It's only as good as the data you start with, what you do with it and what tools you give to it. And so it comes back to what problem you have to solve, and perhaps a knowledge graph approach is something that can help you find your answers.
Wonderful. Sebastian, Jill, and Christina.
Get involved in the reshare community. That would be my pitch.
I would just say we have to work on library-owned infrastructure, community-owned infrastructure. It's something that is imperative for libraries and consortia to think about and invest in. Don't just wait for somebody else to do it. Get involved. Please get involved in reshare. Contact me if you've got questions about that.
Excellent.
I would just echo that. If there are vendors in the room, think about getting involved. Think about just coming to the project to learn about the approach. As a vendor software developer, I've been blown away by how powerful it is to engage with the community in this way.
Wonderful, wonderful. Jamie, last but not least.
I think echoing some of the words of my panelist friends here, the engagement is the most important thing that we can all have. We're all part of an ecosystem, and I think we're all aiming to benefit the users of all of our applications. So we're looking for more insights. We're looking for those new use cases that are emerging right now. And as we're moving into a real unknown in 2021, I think we're going to see a lot more of these new use cases coming out, and we want to hear about them.
Well, I want to thank our esteemed panel for their time today and their preparation for the Innovator session. And I want to thank you, our audience, for your participation. And we look forward to seeing you at next year's Charleston Conference. Enjoy the rest of the conference and have a great day.